Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fifth lecture of the series dedicated to European colonialism and its heritage. Today, Ms. Jelena Vićentić will speak on the subject of Dutch colonialism, but first I will give the word to Mr. Danilo Babić, who will make a small introduction and also present our collection of papers. Mr. Danilo, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Srba. So as Srba already mentioned, a collection of papers is finally out. So it is available on the website of the Institute of European Studies. You can download it absolutely free in the PDF format. And of course, if you prefer the hard copy, you can buy it in the Institute's facilities. It seems like that the collection of papers was a success, and it is, if we may say, on demand. So hurry and get your copy. So let's begin with today's lecture. Our today's speaker, and of course, one of the co-editors of the mentioned book, is Mrs. Jelena Vićentić. She is a political scientist and a philologist, currently a PhD candidate at Faculty of Political Science in Belgrade. She is the author of several articles on development and coloniality and development interventions, or let's say interventions in the name of development in the Global South. Furthermore, her research interests and publications also include the topics about civil society, NGOs, arm control, and disarmament law. I would like to emphasize that Jelena was a part of the collective called ICAN, an international coalition of activists working on banning nuclear weapons, which was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize in the 2017. Furthermore, Jelena has a little surprise in store for us. We also have a guest speaker, Mr. Adi Bramasto from Indonesia, social scientist and a diplomat, and as far as I know, a great friend of Serbia. So Jelena, you may take the floor.
Thank you, Danilo. Thank you very much. So, yeah, I would just like to add to this generous introduction by both you and Srba that in the previous lecture by Jean Casimir, we had this very rare and precious opportunity to learn about colonialism in Haiti. But we had this opportunity to learn by decentering from the colonial or colonizing power, and focusing on the experience, the struggle, and the survival of the people who were colonized. So in this particular lecture, we will try to maintain a similar course. And when I say we, I say we because I believe that learning is done in the best possible way when it's done jointly and when it's done in a team. And this time I have been very fortunate to be able to organize this presentation together with Mr. Adi Bramasto, who is a career diplomat working for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Indonesia, currently head of performance planning section at the Directorate General of Information and Public Diplomacy. But on this particular occasion, Adi is with us in a personal capacity as a political scientist and expert on security matters. And he will be, even though he possesses great expertise on Europe, international organizations, and many other issues, he will be talking about Indonesia and the heroic struggle for liberation of the Indonesian people. So to try and be efficient and not to waste any time, we will start the presentation straight away. So to begin with, it's in a way crucial to clarify certain certain points and certain issues sometimes, and I have heard this on many occasions, Dutch colonialism is referred to as the minor or moderate or benign form of European colonialism. So at this point, as our point of departure, it is necessary for us to make a certain clarification. When we talk about Dutch colonialism, we talk about 3 centuries of slave trade. We talk about slavery practices in which the Netherlands not only participated, but also played the role of a leader. Slavery is a practice in various forms. It survived in all of the Dutch Caribbean colonies until the second half of the 19th century. And it represented the basic social and economic model. It was something that was typical in these areas. And the most drastic case is this, the area of the Suriname, where the harsh conditions of growing sugarcane, coffee, and cotton caused very high mortality rates. So I hate using the numbers, but I will, just as an illustration, use some numbers. At some point at the end of the 19th century, when an ownership database was established, it was determined that there was about 46,000 people, descendants of slaves, and also persons that had been brought directly from Africa to work in the plantations of the Suriname. But during the 2 centuries, from the 17th to the 19th century, it is estimated that 250,000 of people were brought to Suriname. This speaks something about of the extent to which colonialism and slavery were a death project. To give a short overview of the presentation today, so we will discuss or look into the expansion of the Dutch colonial empire and the methodologies of colonial governance, including trade in enslaved people, enslaved human beings, for the purposes of exploitation of their labor in the colonies in South America, Caribbean, and Indonesia. We will also hear about indentured labor of the hundreds of thousands of workers from Asia displaced for the purposes of plantation work throughout the colonial empire. And we will hear about the violent techniques of prevention of resistance of the dispossessed. The wealth acquired through the colonial enterprise enabled achievement of prosperity and the well-being in the so-called motherland, which in this case is the Netherlands. While the entrepreneurial spirit built into the foundations of the colonial empire presents a source of national pride to this day. Implicitly or explicitly, racializing and racist imagery constructed in the course of the colonial era and slavery uninterruptedly influences the production of knowledge. So we will later on in this presentation also reflect upon the concept established by a Dutch historian, Francis Gouda, European colonial grammar, which is something that's continuously at work, that cleanses the perception of the past, but also the present from all negative connotations. Finally, we will also look into the issue of erasure of race and racism as relevant societal factors, and something that leads to the opening of the possibility for self-identification of the Dutch as small but just ethical nation, colorblind nation, thus free of racism, as being inherently on the moral and ethical high ground, thus a guiding light to other folks and nations, to paraphrase Gloria Wekker.
Sorry, sorry to interrupt you. It just we don't see the presentation yet.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know how this had happened.
Yeah, I typed you privately. Yeah. I typed you privately, so you didn't see
I'm
it.
so sorry.
Sorry that I had to interrupt.
Yeah, it just didn't work sharing the screen. I'm so sorry. I thought it was happening. I will try again. Okay. Can you see it now?
Yes, yes, we do.
Yes, it's okay now.
Yes. So yeah. with this first slide that I gave the introduction to, I actually owe you an explanation. What you see in the background, this beautiful calligraphic work in the background is, as a matter of fact, accounting of the Middelburg Commerce Company, the company that was doing, well, approximately 30% of the slave trade by the Dutch. And what you see is the actual accounts. It's the actual bookkeeping on the people, men, women, boys, and girls that were being sold in this particular case in Berbice in Dutch Guiana. And as you can also see in the first 4 columns of the page, these human beings that were being sold for the purposes of forced labor were deprived of their humanity. They were deprived of names. They were deprived of personhood. If they were only referred to, you can see ticked off the actual column if they were a man, a woman, a boy, or a girl. So moving on, this overview of the content, we are moving to a very quick overview of the rise of the Dutch Empire and the so-called Golden Age. So what is crucial in a way to give as the background information about the Dutch colonial project, it is that it originates from the 80-year war for independence from Spain from 1568 to 1648. And it begins with the takeover of the Portuguese colonies. It is the prolonged war with Spain and the necessity to strengthen the naval power of the Dutch state that are considered to be the source of Dutch colonial ambitions. And the Dutch East India Company, which is referred to as VOC, Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, it was founded in 1602, and the founding of the company establishes the framework of Dutch naval rule and spice trade in the wide area of the East Indian archipelago. In Asia, they take over the Portuguese colonies, present-day Indonesia, and colonial fortifications in Taiwan, Ceylon, India, and Japan. In America, apart from Suriname and the colonies in the Caribbean, they had, for a certain period of time, also occupied parts of Brazil, and in the territories of Northern American continent, it was the Hudson Valley in New York. In Africa, the Dutch established fortifications along the coast of West Africa as centers of slave trade, as sort of hubs for slave trade and other forms of trade. And in the south of the continent, near the Cape of Good Hope, they founded a settlement under Jan van Riebeck in 1652. At that time, the traffic of the Dutch East India Company, it required a sort of a stopover, a place where the ships could replenish their stocks on the route to Asia. Dutch African group of colonists, known as the Boers, in response to the strengthening of the British colonial presence and British influence, they spread to other territories of South Africa to the great detriment of the indigenous populations. As early as 1658, basically only some years after the initial settlement, the import of slave labor began from Madagascar first, and then from the areas of today's Mozambique, from India, and so-called East Indies. In the 19th century, the discovery of precious stones and gold, it contributed to a greater import of labor force from other regions of the world. It was both forced and indentured labor. And when fortifications in the West African coast, when they were withdrawn under the pressure from Britain and France, the Boer population in South Africa, it continued to expand. It continued to expand also under British rule, and it gained independence initially as Transvaal state in 1852, and later on as other independent Boer republics. After the establishment of the Union of South Africa, as independent state under British Empire in 1910, there was a division of power between the British and the Boers, and Boer nationalism grew stronger over time and eventually led to a development of a very comprehensive order of segregation that we all know as apartheid. This regime was established in 1948 and lasted until 1989. As this is a very important topic, we will unfortunately not have time to address it in great detail in this particular presentation, also as it does not come under the official colonialism of the Netherlands. So this particular bit, which refers to the Boers in South Africa, we will wrap up just by saying that during the apartheid period, the Netherlands avoided any association with the notorious, the infamous South African regime, despite traditional ties with the Boer community and the fact that since the first settlement, the first colonization of the Dutch, there's been continuous influx of Dutch settlers. But the foundation of the Dutch colonial empire and influence, it finally, in a way, settles, remains in the following territories: the Caribbean islands of Saint Martin, Curaçao, Bonaire, Aruba, Saba, and Statia, or Saint Eustatius, and in the Suriname in South America. Also Indonesia, and in the 19th century, it expands to the entire territory of Indonesian archipelago. One important thing that we sort of need to address early on in the presentation is this myth of the golden age. There's this abundance of attempts at, in a way, whitewashing the history, making this particular part of the history of the Netherlands, which is the first 3/4 of the 17th century, making it the most important and that fundamental and formative stage of Dutch history, which in a way came to life only due to the great entrepreneurial spirit and the right moves made at the right times, which erases entire history of colonialism, slave trade, slavery, and all of the atrocities that were committed during several centuries. And also we could witness, as Danilo had nicely written in the introduction of our publication, we can witness in these days this abundance of attempts at sort of making economic estimates of the achievements of colonialism, reducing the economic benefits from the colonial project, and sort of claiming that the colonial effort was more of a civilizational, humanitarian, generous, benevolent project than actual criminal and exploitative endeavor that it was. So for that particular reason, it is important at this point in time to look back at the actual nature of the colonialism as Professor Ndlovu Gacheni defined it as a project of war, violence, and extractivism, as in short, a death project. So it's important in this segment to mention that even the economic segment of the colonial project for the Netherlands was not insignificant. The income from the colonies is, as a matter of fact, immensely significant, as the costs of construction of the nationwide railway network in the Netherlands, it was covered by the income from the colonies. In a similar manner, Caribbean plantation owners and slave owners from Suriname, they received their reparations from the same funds. Upon abolishment of slavery, they received reparations from that same fund, which actually came from the profits from the colonies. It's also important to mention that some of the biggest businesses, the corporations, the names that we all know and associate with the Netherlands, such as Shell, these companies also have their roots and they owe, in a way, their existence to the colonial project. Shell, one of the largest or even the largest energy company of the world for years, it had been making its initial profits in the colonies. It was originally the Royal Dutch Petroleum Company in the Dutch Indies. And in 1907, it formed Royal Dutch Shell in partnership with the British Transport Company, in which the Dutch royal family is still the largest single shareholder. colonial continuity is also evident in the history of many other companies, such as ABN AMRO Bank. It also originates from a colonial trade society that William I, who was known as the King Merchant, founded by royal decree in 1824 in order to encourage trade between the motherland and the East Indian colonies. So this company operated as the national bank, tax service, chamber of commerce, and the shipping agency. In mid-century, it also comes into the possession of its own plantations. This company was collecting the tax from local populations at the amount of 1/5 of the harvest of the goods, be it coffee, sugar, or tea, which were then auctioned. The Dutch company was affectionately, as it was doing so much good work for Dutch entrepreneurs and businesses, it was called the Small Company, or the successor to the Dutch East India Company. Some historians even today promote the idea of the Dutch past in the Atlantic as an expansion without empire, an exclusively mercantile expansion without the central role of the mother state in the formation of a maritime empire. But the facts show that the Dutch West India Company, which was founded in 1621, based on the East India Company model, that it actually failed to maintain its monopoly and power. And already in the 18th century, it loses its exclusive rights to the slave trade. So the largest share in the trade, it was retained by the private actors, up to 70%. Nevertheless, state power and state control over territories, despite the significant share of private entrepreneurship, remains the decisive factor. The state plays a decisive role in solving the key problem, which is the problem of the labor, of the workforce. In the early stages of the military takeover of Portuguese possessions in present-day Brazil, in 1629 to be precise, the Dutch, by government decree, they offered freedom to indigenous and enslaved members of Portuguese units if they joined the Dutch military against the planters. As Brandon and Fatah Black point out, this was a promise that was almost impossible to keep because the needs of the plantation economy were great. So insufficient imports of the labor of the enslaved at the time, they led to abductions, enslavement of indigenous populations in the Caribbean along the coast of Guyana and beyond. So in the middle of the 17th century, the Dutch actively participated in the trade of the indigenous Caribbean and South American populations, despite the official policies that guaranteed freedom to the indigenous population. In light of recent research, it is believed that the abuse and the exploitation of the indigenous populations resulted in riots, which eventually led to Dutch being pushed out of Brazil. Shortly after the defeat in Brazil, the Dutch focused on the development of the slave trade, and by 1675, they retained a central role in this activity. Initially, it was the private entrepreneurs. From 1635, it was the Dutch West India Company, and the enslaved Africans were brought to the Dutch colonies to work on plantations in Suriname, or to Curaçao, where they were being sold to the British, French, and Spanish planters. Elmina, which was the seat of the Dutch Gold Coast, which is in present-day Ghana, was the center for the distribution and sale of the enslaved people to merchants of other nations too. In the period from 1612 to 1872, the Netherlands had 10 fortifications on the Gold Coast, from which shipments of slaves were regularly sent to South America and the Caribbean. It is estimated in this interval of time that Dutch share in the slave trade was about 7%, or somewhere between 550,000 and 600 Africans. It is important to emphasize, though, that these numbers, these figures, are very, very conservative, as there are no records and there are no archives which include human beings that were being smuggled, that were being transported outside of the official shipments. But it is important to emphasize that even according to the data available, it was mortality rate during transport was 17%. And this number would, as a matter of fact, double if we took into consideration the number of the people that would die immediately after arrival to the colonies. Slavery in Dutch colonies was considered particularly cruel. Even though riots occurred often, Dutch authorities would brutally suppress them with the help of local militias. In 1795, a rebellion broke out in Curaçao, inspired by the ideas of equality and abolition of slavery. And after some initial successes of the rebels, the colonial troops managed to defeat them and execute dozens of rebels without delay. Remaining rebels were to surrender after the promise of amnesty, but only within a week's time, another 30 leaders were executed in the most terrible ways. And one of the leaders, Fula, in a conversation with the Catholic priest, he provided the following statement, which was recorded to this day. All people share the same parents, Adam and Eve, and slavery thus means abuse. And only animals, even animals, get better treatment than slaves. This event is still considered one of the most significant in the history of the island, and the riots continued in 1799 and 1800, only to be stopped by British and American intervention, which then returned the territories under the control of Netherlands. At the end of the 18th century, strong condemnation of slavery throughout Europe led to first an introduction of the ban on slave trade in Britain, which came into force in 1834, and then France in 1848, and Netherlands was among the last. They introduced the ban in 1848, but with a delayed effect, basically entering into force in 1863, as the law was to provide certain years, or shall we say more than a decade of transition, so the workers would remain in the status of de facto slavery for another decade. The Gold Coast was then, as it's lost its purpose as a slave trade hub, it was exchanged for North Sumatra and the right to recruit labor in India. But regarding the Caribbean colonies, it's important to say that we're talking about 6 completely different islands. It's Aruba, Bonaire, Curaçao, Sava, Statia, and Saint Martin. And the only connection between these islands is the actual colonization and exploitation of the people enslaved and exploitation of the territory and resources. The function of these colonies, it also differs. Curaçao and Statia, they've been regional centers of slave trade for a very long time, but also illegal trade and piracy. Saint Martin and Bonaire, they were very important for the Netherlands for their salt mines, as these were providing the salt necessary for much loved salted herring. And regarding Suriname, which is in the South American continent, it was primarily a plantation colony. Despite colonists from Europe, according to available data, 90% of Suriname's population were enslaved workers of African descent until late in the 19th century. According to preserved sources, differences in the status of the enslaved and freed workers were practically non-existent in the context of urban slavery on the islands. On one hand, enslaved had this appearance of freedom of movement, but simultaneously those that were freed, they remained in this legal gray zone. Their status was not exactly regulated. So they, as a matter of fact, still continued to live and work as the enslaved. From the beginning, the island territories were connected to the Suriname, which was, as a matter of fact, the place where the colonial administration was centralized in Paramaribo until mid-19th century. Suriname and the Caribbean colonies, they were united as dependent territories under the Crown administration from 1848 until 1958. And at that point in time, there is a whole history of colonization attempts. And it is important to mention that in Netherlands to this day, there is this prevailing view that Netherlands, just like it was a model colonial power, and just like there is this belief that the Dutch colonialism was peaceful and civilizing, that the decolonization process was also inclusive and peaceful and democratic. So this process was implemented in several phases, and first it involved change of status to overseas territories, inclusion of representatives of Suriname and the Antilles into the Dutch Council of Ministers in 1947. And then a few years later, there was certain steps towards expansion of autonomy. The Statute of the Kingdom of Netherlands in 1954, it equalizes the rights in all parts of the country, introducing parliamentary democracy, right to vote, and obligation of development aid. But in this particular context, it's important to mention that development aid in the coming period puts Suriname and the Antilles in a particularly vulnerable position, a position of, in a way, incomplete autonomy, as it enables Dutch influence in the sphere of education and in the sphere of cultural development. Suriname gains its independence in 1975, and this is unfortunately followed by years of social instability and conflict. In Curaçao, in 1969, there is a number of protests for workers' rights, which lead to intensification of consultations on independence, but still end with the joint decision of the Dutch Antilles on phased decolonization. Aruba today has achieved the status of autonomy within the Netherlands. This brings us now to the topic of Indonesia, which is considered, as you can see in this slide, the most precious jewel, or there was a number of expressions, expressions of love and endearment that the Dutch had used to Indonesia, and it was the jewel in the crown, the most precious jewel, girdle of emeralds, many different things, and this expresses this particular but also delusional, we can say, attitude of the Netherlands toward Indonesia. In this first quote by the Indonesian historian Mohtar Lubis, you can see what this attitude actually was like, how the Dutch came to the country under the rainbow to trade in spices, but greed blinded them, and they did not see the culture, dignity, and sense of honor of Indonesians. They brought destruction and death to everything in their path, as if they were possessed. So in this segment, it is necessary to take some time to look at the character and the work of, at the very beginning of the first colonial, shall we say, administrator or the representative for the East India Company in Java, Jan Pieterszoon Koen. He's seen as the founder of Dutch colonial empire in the East, and he's the founder of Batavia, which was the capital of Dutch East Indies. But this man, just to give one example, as there are many, many examples of cruelty in his governance and rule of the Eastern colonies, but he's remembered as a ruthless colonizer and organizer of 1621 massacre on the island of Banda Neira. The crime is considered the first commercial genocide in history, because there was no effort made at the time to even create an illusion that the whole thing, the armed campaign, the massacre, the death, that it was about anything other than the Dutch desire to achieve a monopoly in the spice trade. Thousands of Banda residents were killed, executed, taken into slavery in Java, in order for the Dutch to receive exclusive rights to nutmeg. For those of you that are not so well acquainted with spices, in Serbian, it is actually muskatni oraščić. So this particular spice was deemed by Jan Pieterszoon Koen to be worthy of thousands of lives. And as the data goes, there was 14,000 people in the island before the beginning of this campaign. And after the campaign, only 500 remained, as the majority were either killed during the massacre, assassinated, or taken into slavery. In a similar manner, villages and crops were destroyed, and the population of some of the Moluccas was decimated due to cloves. In Serbian language, it is karamfilić. From 19th century on, plantation production of tobacco, coffee, tea, sugar, indigo, spices, which were all products of key importance for the Dutch economy, it was regulated by the so-called system of cultivation, cultuurstelsel. And in this particular system, this cultivation system, this implied the obligation for the farmers to grow the products which are required in the European market on at least 20% of arable land, and then to hand these over to the Dutch institutions in the name of tax. In addition to the classical forms of slavery, East Indian colonies were forced to participate in so-called public works and works on the infrastructure, which was useful for the purposes of more effective extraction. And for that particular purpose, the Dutch legal system in East Indies formalized certain dependent statuses of serfdom, so that this type of work could be put into action. Massive use of so-called coolies, the workers in plantation production, it is also a result of changes in the Dutch approach. Unlike the first centuries of the Dutch presence in Java, where sugarcane production was tied to rural communities, with the expansion, there was a need to do recruitment outside in the provinces, other provinces, and by importing Chinese workers, mostly from Singapore. And as Bremen concludes, in this particular case, unbridled capitalism requires a mobile and flexible workforce, and the state made this possible by creating an adequate legal framework. So for this particular purpose, a decree on coolies of 1880 was put into place, which in a formal sense provided for some sort of employment contract for coolies that were brought to work in the plantations. But in practice, there was an actual lack of freedom of movement, lack of freedom in choosing the place or type of work. So the workers would, without the right to decide on their own movement, transported to work in plantations from Sumatra to the Caribbean. And this work was exhausting, and escape attempts were frequent. And this is where the institution of the so-called agricultural police comes into play. And these police units, they patrol plantations in search of fugitives. They punish them by flogging and execution. One important segment of Dutch presence in East Indies is this phenomenon of Javanism, which is a specifically Dutch form of Orientalism. It is based on a Dutch projection of a hierarchically structured system of values and aesthetics, with an emphasis on the court culture of Hindu Java and Bali. And this Javanism, it's left a mark in the sciences and art, because there were many Dutch scientists that would come to East Indies that would do a lot of ethnographic, anthropological, historical, archaeological work. But from today's perspective, most of this work is, as a matter of fact, scientifically problematic, as it is less of a science and more of an essentialized product of colonial imagination. This is also something that Francis Gouda, a historian, she explains by applying the concept of colonial mimicry and projection. The Dutch, they come from the context of a small European country of uniform organization and composition. And in East India region, they faced an incomprehensible, superior multitude and diversity of peoples, languages, customs, art forms, traditions, both cultural and agricultural. And the Dutch view encompasses only one part of this very complex and multifaceted reality. And the colonial observer identifies only certain patterns as significant or predominant. So Gouda calls this transfer of simplified and projected cognitive matrices in colonial practice, but also to this day, European colonial grammar that assumes the right to, in a way, shape, but also to make corrections to the reality of the colonized. And in this way, the developmental and ethical mission is reconciled with the violent practices of colonial rule. So, as you can see also in these quotes offered in the slide, Indonesia was central to the development of the technology of Dutch colonialism, and it is of crucial importance for the Dutch economic rise. And this also relationship, the attitude of the Netherlands towards Indonesia was naturalized to that extent that at one point the Dutch governor in the 1930s, he said, "We, the Dutch people, have been here for 300 years, and it will take another 300 years to get us out of here." As you can see in the quote by the Sartono Kartodirjo, Indonesian historian, this history of the Dutch in Indonesia is not a history of peaceful and civilizing effort. It is a history of peasant revolt. So I will wrap up this part of my presentation at this point. And I would like to ask Adi to continue with his part of the presentation, which is about the struggle of the Indonesian people for liberation, the heroic struggle. Adi, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Jelena, for your kind introduction and also for the opportunity given to me to be able to share with you a little bit of my view regarding the Indonesian struggle of independence. I also would like to thank the organizer, the IES, and the moderator for giving a brief description about me. And so just a bit of a disclaimer, as already stated before by Jelena and by the moderator, I'm now a diplomat working for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Indonesia, but I'm here on a personal capacity. So it's not the official position of Indonesia. Anything in my presentation is not the official position of Indonesia, even though some will be, of course, based on facts and the official statements of the government. And if I can just share screen now. Jelena, can you please stop the screen sharing?
Yes,
so I can share?
I'm trying. Just a sec.
Okay.
There is something that,
Yeah,
okay.
Great. Thank you very much. Yeah, and also to inform you, I actually did my master's degree in Serbia under the World in Serbia Scholarship Program by the government of Serbia. I studied in the Faculty of Security Studies from 2012 to 2014. So actually, because of that, I'm a little bit disappointed about this event because I don't get to practice my rusty Serbian, but I believe that there will be the next occasion for me to do that. So with that, let's begin my presentation now about Dutch colonialism and the Indonesian struggle for independence. Now, I would like to apologize first because even though I know that you tasked me to talk about the struggle of independence, but I still have to give some brief introduction about Indonesia and mention some key facts that would be very important in order to understand the whole framework of colonialism in Indonesia. So in case you don't know, which I'm sure you already know, all of you, Indonesia is located here in the world map. It's considered to be a Southeast Asian country in the region of Southeast Asia, but even so, Indonesia is not really technically an Asian country because we are located between two oceans, the Pacific and the Indian, and between two continents. So Indonesia is technically a transcontinental country in which the eastern part of Indonesia used to be connected to Australia and the bigger Oceanian region. And as you can see here, there's the Weber's line, which also divide the fauna of Indonesia, in which in the eastern part of Indonesia you can find Australian animals such as wallabies, which is some sort of kangaroos, and in the eastern part of in the western part of Indonesia you can find basically standard Asian fauna such as elephant, rhinoceros, and the tigers. And the central part of Indonesia is basically its own thing because it has been isolated for thousands of years, because even during the Ice Age, it was not connected neither to Asia nor to Australia, so that we have several endemic animals which only exist there and nowhere else in the world, such as the giant Komodo dragon, which you can see. Now, just to give you a little bit of an overview about the size of Indonesia, here we can see the map of Europe superimposed by the map of Indonesia. So it's basically almost from one end to the other end of Europe. To be clear, because of this, we have 3 time zones, and from the easternmost to the westernmost point of Indonesia, it's around 5,000 kilometers. To give you a bit of sense of distance, it's as if you're traveling from Belgrade to London, but 3 times. And we have 44,000 kilometers of coastline, which is actually a bit longer than the equator of the Earth, which means that if you walk through the coast of Indonesia, it is actually farther than if you walk around the world. And the territorial size of Indonesia is 5.19 million kilometers squares, in which 1.5 million kilometers are land and 3.2 million kilometers squares are sea. So we have literally more ocean than land, and it's still excluding the 2.55 million kilometers square exclusive economic zones that we have. A bit of more statistics. We have 16,000 islands, which makes us the biggest archipelagic country in the world in terms of size. We have, based on the census of 2020, 271 million population, in which 87% of them, or around 229 millions, are Muslims, making us the world's largest Muslim country. Including its vassal states, do not really reach all parts of the Papuan Island and Bornean Island, even though it also reached some parts of today's other countries, such as a little part of Malaysia here and Philippines and also Vietnam. And now we came to the myth of 350 years of Dutch colonialism in Indonesia. Why I say myth? Because this is a common knowledge. I mean, you can find these numbers almost everywhere, and even Jelena also mentioned it before. And if you ask any Indonesian, most of them will answer that Indonesia was under Dutch colonization for 350 years. Now, this is actually not true, because the advance of Dutch colonialism happened slowly and gradually, and also even if you count it from the first conquest until the independence in 1945, it was still far from the claim of 350 years. So we proclaim our independence in 1945. If you reduce that by 350 years, you will get the year of 1595. Now, the first Dutch expedition to Indonesia, led by Cornelis de Houtman, happened in 1596. And that was only an expedition for intelligence gathering, far from occupation or subjugation of Indonesia, in which he gathered information which will be useful for the future trades of the Netherlands in Indonesia, including the local customs and traditions, the price of spices, where they can get the spices. And even there was this incident where Cornelis de Houtman was sent away by the ruler of Banten because of his arrogance. And the myth of 350 years basically came from the sentence of Cornelis de Jonge, which was already mentioned also before by Jelena. He was the Governor General of Dutch East Indies from 31 to 36, and he once said that we have ruled with cane and whip for 300 years, and we will continue ruling for 300 more years in the territory of modern days Indonesia. And this rhetoric was actually later on used by the founding fathers of Indonesia in order to burn the spirit of the people, in order to convince the people that, hey, we have been staying for too long, for hundreds of years under colonialism, so it's time for us to fight back, even though in reality it's not really the 350 years that was already mentioned before. And some of the important years in the advance of Dutch colonization in Indonesia, in which you can choose like one of them on to be maybe the starting point of the colonization. In 1602, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Company, or VOC, was founded in the Netherlands. and they started to open a representative office in Banten, which was called Batavia after that, in 1603. And the first conquest of the modern-day territory of Indonesia didn't happen until 1622, starting with the conquest of Banda Island in the Moluccas archipelago. And it was just a very small part of territory of Indonesia because of the monopoly of nutmeg. And then after that, there was the conquest of Makassar in 1667. And VOC basically advanced and ruled more and more places in Indonesia gradually, until finally in 1799 it was disbanded because of corruption, mismanagement, and also competition by mainly the British East India Company, so that only by 1800 Indonesia was colonized by the Netherlands. So if you would like to count the time of Dutch colonization in terms of country, it only started in 1800. And arguably before 1800, Indonesia was colonized by a company, which might sound weird for some of you who are, as Serbs, for example, you might be more familiar to the colonization of Ottoman Empire, which was mainly because of the territorial expansion. But as Jelena mentioned, in Indonesia, it was more about capitalism, and you can totally see that from the way they managed the colony, and also from the sheer fact that Indonesia was actually colonized by, admittedly state-owned company, but still a company for several hundred years. And VOC was frequently mentioned as a state within a state. Why is that? So there's this approximation about the value of the Verenigde Oost-Indische Company, that it is actually similar to the values of 20 modern companies now. Okay, so this claim is a bit disputable because there are many complicated calculations regarding inflation, and also there are some disputes regarding the financial reports made by the VOC. But what was undisputable was that it was one of the biggest, if not the biggest, companies at that time. It was rivaled only by the British East India Company. So how could VOC be very strong, that strong, so that it could subjugate very vast territories such as Indonesia in the end? Because here we have to see it was given rights by Dutch Parliament to monopolize trade from Cape Hope in Africa to Magellan Strait. And it's not a normal company because it was given privileges, or called the octrooi rights, by the Parliament of the Netherlands. And they consist of, the VOC has the rights to have its own armed force, it has the rights to declare war and peace with other states, to conclude treaties, it could recruit independently, and it could even issue its own currency. So in various aspects, the VOC was closer to a sovereign country than a company. And of course, in the past, where we didn't have the comfort of information technology, in order to conduct communication with the Netherlands, it would take them at least 1 to 3 months, so that basically VOC was operating mostly independently at its own rights. And it was using its tremendous rights and power in order to wage military campaign in the so-called East Indies, mainly against the Portuguese and the British, which were also ruling some portions of the area. Colonization of Indonesia. Again, there are some debates here, because Indonesia did not really exist prior to Dutch colonization. So could you really say that Indonesia was colonized when Indonesia itself didn't exist? Because as I just said before, in the past, we had different tribes, kingdoms, sultanates who were basically not that united, and there was no national awareness that we were part of one nation or one country. And also, as I have already mentioned before, not all territories were under the direct rule of the Netherlands or even by the VOC at the same time, in which the advance happened gradually and slowly. So the advance of colonization starting with trade in the beginning, and then the creation of unfair treaties with the indigenous people, which then resulted in monopoly, and then only in the end followed by repressive actions. And also, I could say that the Dutch and the VOC were not really present in all parts of Indonesia equally, even by the end of the colonization era. For example, even though it was very much present in the Java Island and Sumatra Island, of course, and even Borneo, as you can see here, it was pretty much absent in the island of Papua, and mainly Papua was recognized as a Dutch territory only through claim of the Netherlands, because it only put a flag in 1678, and then it built a fort in 1828, which was directly dismantled and abandoned in 1836 because of the disease. And then after that, they just put some stakes on the coast of Papua just as proofs of claims that they own the island. And also after that, the Netherlands kind of justified their claims of the entire island of Papua, or at least the western part of Papua, because after that the British claimed the eastern part of the island, through subordination of the Sultanate of Tidore, which ruled the island since the 16th century. And only in 1895, after a treaty with the British dividing the island, the Dutch set up its first administrative office, which means that before that period of time, it was pretty much absent. Even when they opened their administrative office, their presence there was very much different compared to the presence in the other islands, which were producing more spices for them. So now we will talk about the policies, the provisions of the colonial government. Jelena already mentioned about Kulturstelsel, in which every village in the territory of East Indies have to allocate a portion of their land to plant designated export commodities or crops. And the villagers with no land to cultivate, they have to work for 75 days in a year in VOC plantation, of course, with no payment. There's also verplichte leverantie, which is the obligation to sell the commodities only to VOC at their own sanctioned prices, regardless of the market price at that time, which was, of course, highly unfair for the local population. There was also contingenten, the tax for the indigenous people for cultivating the lands claimed to be owned by the VOC in the forms of, again, commodities that they have to give away for free. There is extirpatri, the rights to destroy excessive crops to control the price and monopoly. So if we're producing too much crops, which would be dangerous for the price, as it can lower the price, and it can also create the possibility of Indonesians selling it to other European powers, then the Dutch people would just eradicate the excessive crops. And in order to do that, they also conducted hongeitochten, which is some sort of sea patrol of a Dutch fleet, to ensure the trade monopoly. So it had two functions. First, in order to prevent the Indonesians to trade with other people, and also to destroy the crops when they see that in some places they had excessive crops, and also to check whether there were other colonial powers such as the Portuguese or the British, which might come to the territory in order to trade with the local people. Now, there is a first phase in the struggle of independence, which is frequently called as the local struggle for independence, because here you will see that many of the indigenous people who, of course, dislike the rule of the Dutch people, they pick up their weapons and they struggled, but they didn't do it in order to attain independence as Indonesia as one single country, because at that time there was no national awareness first. And these local struggles for independence basically existed in most, if not all, parts of Indonesia. As you can see here, we had it in Moluccas Archipelago, in Central Java, and also in all of the main biggest islands of Indonesia, including Bali, Sumatra, Sulawesi, and Borneo, in which the local people, including the local royalties, picked up arms against the Dutch because they felt that their rule were overridden by the Dutch, and also that they started to lose many of their privileges, and also, of course, that the people were suffering under Dutch rule. And then the national movement was considered to start in 1908 up until 1945, the year of our independence. Here, the struggle also existed in the forms of the struggle of expression, in forms of academic struggle, not only the physical struggle in forms of wars and conflicts. And here the national awareness started to appear from the feeling of unity that we suffered similar fate under oppressions. And there were several different organizations founded here. And these organizations transcended the boundaries of local languages and local identities. And it might culminate in the creation of Indonesische Vereniging, or Association of the Indonesian Students in the Netherlands, in which they started to use the name Indonesia, after previously the territory was known as East Indies, which I will tell you in a short while. And also the creation of the first political party in today's Indonesia, which is the National Indonesian Party, founded by the future first president of Indonesia at that time, Sukarno, with the demand of independence right here and right now. And many of the, regardless to say, many of the founders of these organizations were exiled or even killed by the Dutch colonial rule. So what's in the name? Maybe some of you who are not so familiar with the region of Indonesia might be a bit confused about the usage of different interchangeable terms. As Jelena also already mentioned several times in the presentation, you heard names like East Indies, Dutch Indies, and also later on you hear the name Indonesia. So which one is which? And also, why is it called East Indies? Is it related to India? So it all started in the late 15th century when the Europeans discovered an archipelago which was located east of India, which they discovered earlier. So because it's located east of India, then logically speaking, it's called East Indies. So this is a very interesting Eurocentrism here, because Jelena also mentioned before about West Indies. So for some of you might not know, West Indies are located in the Caribbean. So why is it called West Indies? Because of course it's located west of India, which was actually America, which Columbus mistook for India at that time. So from that small mistake, you have now East Indies and West Indies that are worlds apart. And sometimes also because it was located nearby India, some people call it Dutch Indies, simply by Dutch Indies. And of course, this creates a lot of confusion, in which in the end, many of the founding fathers and also the nationalists of Indonesia chose to change the name to Indonesia. Now, unfortunately, the name Indonesia was not really originally Indonesian, because it is actually from Greek language. So it's from ancient Greek, in which Indos means India and Nessos means island. So basically, again, it means the Indian islands, just in a different language. And it was first coined by George Samuel Winston Earle in 1847 in the Journal of the Indian Archipelago, which, again, to be clear, is Indonesia, has nothing to do with India, and Eastern Asia, in which he coined the terms Indonesians. And then another European writer coined the term Indonesia in 1850. And the Indonesian nationalist movement in 1922 picked up this name, because, as I told you earlier, they prefer this name because it avoids confusion with India. It also, of course, doesn't contain the word Dutch or something related to the colonial power. And also it has some sort of neutrality. As I've already mentioned before, Indonesia is very diverse, and we need something to unite us together. So it will be a bit problematic in order if we were to use a name from one already existing indigenous language in Indonesia. And I will also discuss about this a bit later. So Indonesia, even though, again, it came from Europeans as well, but it was considered to be something that is neutral, that all of us can stand together with. Another name that also appeared as one of the candidates for the territory of today's Indonesia is Nusantara. So if you remember about the empire of Majapahit, which I already mentioned before, so it was basically a Javanese empire of the Javanese people, which was mainly from Central Java. And Nusantara was the term given by the Majapahit Empire to refer to the archipelagos outside of the realm of Majapahit. And it means basically outer islands or between islands, like between many islands, archipelago basically in today's term. And this term was taken and recoined again by some of the Indonesian nationalists, Daus Dekker, which was half Dutch, half Indonesian, and Ki Hajar Dewantara as an alternative name for Indonesia. And they deemed this name to be more appropriate because it didn't contain any European element. It was totally native to the land. Now, there was no official or written reason why this was not accepted as the name for the future country of Indonesia. And I have an analysis here, which is again, my personal opinion, so you would take it with a grain of salt. The name Nusantara, even though it was deemed to be more indigenous, it was not really that neutral, because again, it was coined by the Javanese Empire, in which some of the other, let's say, indigenous Indonesians from other places which were subjugated by the empire might still have some bitterness about. So it was not really in relations to the spirit of unity, it was not really that supportive. So taking something which is actually foreign and from outside might be more beneficial at that time for the nationalist movement. And there are also some important other historical facts happening in the creation of the national movement and and the sense of the national unity. In 1928, the youths of different places of today's Indonesia, they gathered and they proclaimed one homeland, Indonesia, one nation, Indonesian nation, and upholding the language of unity, the Indonesian language. This will be later on proclaimed as the only official language of Indonesia, even though practically we have hundreds, if not more than 1,000 languages in Indonesia. Now, this is also a very interesting fact here, that a group of people already proclaimed about the existence of a language which never really existed before. So how is this possible? As I told you before, the name of Indonesia didn't exist before, and it was picked up by the nationalist movement a bit later, after it was coined in the scientific communities of the Europeans. And previously, there was a Malay language, which is of course still existing now, mainly in the territory of modern days Malaysia and in some parts of Indonesia. And Malay was already widely used as lingua franca as early as the 7th century. By the Empire of Sriwijaya at that time, which was located in modern-day Sumatra and some parts of the Malayan Peninsula, which is part of Malaysia now. And it's also used as the language of trade since the 12th century. And there was one form of Malay language, which is considered to be Low Malay or Melayu Pasar, which was used in Pazar, as you know, which means the market. So it became, the Malay language became simpler, and it acquired many foreign loan words from different places all over the world. Depends on the traders that came to Indonesia to trade goods and, of course, spices with the indigenous people at that time. So we took this language, which is already a combination of many different languages with big influence from Arabic, Persian, Portuguese, of course, Dutch, and a little bit of English, and we standardized it 10 times since the first language congress in 1938, so that the current form of Indonesian is highly regular and simple. It has to be simple because it is the second language for everyone in Indonesia, even for the Malays, because the standardized form of Indonesian become quite not the same with the literary version of the Malay language. And what was the reason again for this? It was again neutrality, just like the way we chose the name Indonesia, because I don't have the exact data from that time, but if you see the current data from now, from the census of 2010 and 2020, we have around 95 million Javanese, which is the majority of ethnic groups in Indonesia. It consists of 40% of Indonesian. And by the standard practice, it will be much easier, of course, just to choose the language majority as the language of the newly independent nation. But again, this might be perceived as some form of discrimination by other ethnic groups who do not share the same language. And okay, even though Indonesian language based on Malay was not really neutral, because it was based on some existing language, not really out of nowhere, unlike Esperanto as an artificial language, it was not really deemed to be threatening of the national unity. Why? Because Malays were and still are minority in Indonesia. So based on the data in census of 2010, we only have 5 million Malay ethnicity in Indonesia, which is only 2.27% of the entire Indonesian population, which makes it, much more acceptable by Indonesian people compared to using the language of the absolute majority, the Javanese. And the Dutch colonization appeared to end in 1942. when we had the Japanese occupation during the Second World War, in which from Kalijati Agreement, the Netherlands fully surrendered to Japan. And at that time, Japan liked to say that, you know, they were the liberator of Indonesia and many other Asian countries, Southeast Asian mostly. But is it really the case? During the Japanese occupation, again, we had some sort of indentured labors. It's called romusha in Japanese, to build strategic infrastructure for the Japanese, including railroads and some vital facilities. And many people actually died from the overwork of the forced labor and from famine, because they were not fed with enough foods and with nourished foods. And here you can see from the picture above, they were the romusha, the indentured laborers of Indonesians, which were extremely malnourished. And of course, the death estimates at that time was around 4 million people from famine and forced labor, not from conflict. So you can imagine how the bad condition of life at that time. And there was some confiscation of valuables of the people to budget the Japanese the war that the Japanese waged in different fronts during the Second World War. And at that time, even though the Japanese, the Prime Minister Koiso, promised that Indonesia will gain independence in the future given by the Japanese, they never really give exact date, so that the nationalists decided after the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombing in August 1945 to directly proclaim independence and not wait for the Japanese to give the independence over to Indonesia. So finally, on August 17, 1945, Indonesia proclaimed its independence as an independent country. So does it mean that the struggle ended? Far from that. The Netherlands never really acknowledged the proclamation of independence of Indonesia at that time. And when the Allied troops led by the British came to Indonesia to disarm the Japanese, the Dutch came with them in order to conduct policing act, because they thought that it was still the territory of the Netherlands, and because of that they had rights to conduct acts of police in the territory of Indonesia at that time. There were 19 major battles waged between 1944 to 1949, and at that time we didn't call it the War of Independence, we call it War to maintain our independence, because as far as we were concerned, we were already independent since 1945. There were some monumental battles here, the Battle of Surabaya, the Bandung Sea of Fire, in which 200,000 of Bandung city inhabitants burned their house in the span of 7 hours to prevent the city to be used as a Dutch base. And of course, there was the first military aggression in 47 and the second military aggression in 1948. We shouldn't forget that struggle doesn't only happen in the physical realm, but also there's the diplomatic struggle by the diplomats at that time. In March 1946, we gained first recognition from Egypt. And then in 46, we started the first diplomatic mission of negotiation with the Netherlands and allies. We started to open offices, which will be Indonesian embassies and consulates in the future. And finally, in 46, we signed the Linggarjati Agreement with the Netherlands, in which the Netherlands acknowledged the de facto Republic of Indonesia only in the territories of 3 islands, Java, Sumatra, and Madura. And the Indonesian nationalists accepted this at that time being as part of their strategy to at least temporarily gain the acknowledgement of the Dutch and to cease the hostilities, because also from this agreement, they managed to gain the commitment of the Dutch to leave Indonesia the latest by January 1st, 1949. But we also had to make a very big concession in which the founding fathers agreed of the eventual creation of Indonesian Netherlands Union, which would be headed by the Queen of the Netherlands. And we continued the diplomacy also in the multilateral lane, in which we managed to invite the United Nations Security Council's Committee of Good Offices to come to Indonesia in 1947. And we achieved truce amidst the struggle to maintain independence, which I already mentioned earlier, through Renville Agreement aboard of USS Renville, an American warship in the territory of Indonesia. We opened more diplomatic missions to open trade with South American countries, and finally, we achieved the UNSC resolution of January 49, which ceased all of military activities from the Indonesian and the Dutch side. The last important conference that we had was in December 1949, in which finally the Netherlands conducted complete transfer of power to Indonesia. And from that time on, the Netherlands acknowledged the independence of Indonesia in 1949, not in 1945. And up until 2005, this was their official position. Only one day before the 60th anniversary of Indonesian independence, the Netherlands started to acknowledge that 17th of August of 1945 is the official date of the independence of Indonesia. And starting from that point on, the Dutch diplomats started to be present in the ceremony of the anniversary of Indonesian independence, which are held by Indonesian government or by Indonesian embassies abroad, and they never came to that ceremony before 2005 because they didn't recognize the date and the year of the independence. And after we gained our independence, we didn't stop there. We also tried to support other countries who just gained independence also from colonial powers by organizing Asian African Conference in Bandung in 1955. 29 countries were represented in the conference, which represented more than half of the world's population, and it resulted in 10 Bandung Principles, which were mainly against colonialism and also neo-colonialism, supporting the newly independent countries and promoting economic cooperation. And there was a very interesting fact here. Cyprus, which was not yet independent at that time, was also invited, and it was represented by its future king at that time, the future first president at that time, Makarios III. So this really showed the commitment of Indonesia to support each other, the people who were under the oppression of colonial rule, even though they were not yet acknowledged formally by the colonial power. And now we have the Asian African Museum in Bandung, where the conference took place. It is now organized and maintained by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It just so happened that it's also under my directorate of public diplomacy. And if you would like to see some of the historical events and some of the memorabilia that we have there, you can visit this link, asianafricanmuseum.org, and you can have a virtual tour of the museum. So I'm sorry if it takes longer than expected. I know you asked me to speak not more than 10 minutes, Jelena, but thank you very much for your kind attention, and I will be happy to have further discussions with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adi. Thank you. It was a really wonderful presentation. And I think we will be able to, in a way, organize some future opportunities for you to present in even more detail, because this was really incredibly educational and informative. Thank you very much. So now, in closing, I will just add, and I hope you can see my presentation now, because my computer is very, very slow. You see it?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
I have to say it. Thank you.
So in closing, I will add something on the perceptions of colonialism in the Netherlands today, and the cultural heritage that comes out of the colonial past. The foundations of the Dutch identity ideal, this so-called Batavian myth, they have been nurtured and maintained since the beginning of the colonial endeavor. And this can also be seen in the writing of Hugo Grotius, who describes the national type of the honest Dutchman, a simple, hardworking man with Calvinist values, who is patient, God-fearing, and is inclined towards trade and law and order. In public discourse today, as in the past, the notion of this elegant and well-polished, enlightened colonialism, which is exemplary, this is something that still persists. This understanding is a part of, I wouldn't say cultural heritage, but definitely cultural archive of the Netherlands. And Dutch historian Remco Raben, he emphasizes that a thorough consideration of the Dutch role in the world's imperial history is necessary, but it's necessary to look into it as a whole without essentializing Dutch identity and without the prejudice of Dutch exceptionalism. So this brings us to the survey that Arva Awan had also mentioned in her earlier lecture, which was a survey on colonialism conducted in 2019 among citizens of the UK, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Germany. And the survey showed that only Dutch citizens have a higher level of pride in their country's colonial past than the British. More than 50% of respondents thought the imperial past was exclusively a source of pride, while only 6% found reasons for shame in the past. 17% expressed the opinion that colonization had harmful consequences for other nations and countries, while the others found no such facts, basically, in the past of their country. So for a large number of the Dutch, the attitude towards the colonial past involves filtering and defending of something that is considered a positive legacy. So they're separating so-called golden days from dark pages. And this approach neglects the complexity of the colonial interactions and the resulting identities. And this brings us to the concept of anthropologist Gloria Wekker, the concept of white innocence. Gloria Wekker, a Surinamese Dutch anthropologist, with the point of departure in Saussure's discourse on colonialism and the thesis that colonization cannot be innocent, emphasizes that 400 years of colonial rule must reflect on the processes of formation of meaning. And in the Dutch context, this reservoir of knowledge and feelings remains unrecognized and it remains hidden. She finds certain paradoxes in the dominant self-representation of the Dutch. And one of these paradoxes relates to the knowledge of the imperial past and the absence of information about colonialism and slavery in the Dutch educational system. So generations have been shaped by scientific colonialism, also scientific racism, the European economic narrative, while simultaneously operationalizing and denying race and racism. Therefore, the central concept in white innocence is an epistemology of ignorance, continued enjoyment of the privileges offered by a racial hierarchic order. It is made possible due to the lack of knowledge and awareness of systemic racism. And one example for such a societal phenomenon and occurrence is the phenomenon of Zwarte Piet, Black Peter, that Danilo had also mentioned in his presentation about Belgium. And as Danilo explained, this is a much loved, in the Dutch lore, a much loved figure of Santa Claus, basically accompanying act. The problem with this accompanying act is that it is a character that appears in blackface, and its appearance is grotesque. It should also symbolically, in a way, represent everything that is opposite from the benevolent Santa. So this case indicates these mechanisms of protection of ignorance and white innocence, because despite many protests of a large number of citizens of the Netherlands in the last decades, petitions, studies, public appearances in which arguments had been made about Black Peter as a humiliating stereotype and ritualized degradation. So-called tradition, it continues under the auspices of the state. And the defense of this practice, which is officially somehow deemed to be popular and innocent fun for the children, the defense of this practice is very aggressive. Each of the protest attempts experienced very aggressive reaction of racist and xenophobic hate speech and other similar actions. So activist Quincy Gario, that you can see in this photo, who is one of the initiators of the protests against the Zwarte Piet, he was at one point arrested for disturbing the public order only for wearing a T-shirt with the inscription that said Black Peter is racism. In public, however, the defense of this racist practice, it's presented as the protection of freedom of expression and religious tolerance. And Gloria Wecker finds in this elements of post-colonial melancholy and anxiety and fear of the current demographic changes, which makes Black theater a symbol worthy of preservation at all costs. Social norm of tolerance and freedom of expression here turns into a right to humiliate. It's a freedom to violate the dignity and humanity of others, with the implicit positioning of Black theater as, in a way, a criterion for belonging and expressing belonging to the Dutch nation. But in recent decades, this debate on various issues of the colonial past, racism, opposition to immigration, as well as new studies of the erased histories of slavery, slave trade, and violent colonial expansion, they, as a matter of fact, led to very significant social and academic shifts. This is one of the examples, the project of Black Archives, which is a very unique historical archive, but also an activist project based in Amsterdam. Also, since 2019, the Museum of the City of Amsterdam, for example, had abolished the use of the term Golden Age in order to give its contribution to the correction of historical injustices. The notion of Golden Age, they said, creates positive association of prosperity, abundance, progress, while neglecting war, slavery, forced labor, and cost of countless human lives that created that prosperity at home in the Netherlands. Nevertheless, the view of the necessary and purposeful cruelty of colonialism in order to enable a civilizational breakthrough, it is still present in public discourse and in some of the recent year statements by Prime Minister Mark Rutte. So he was saying that removing monuments to controversial figures from the past, as has happened in other countries, this will not solve the problem of racism in the Dutch society because the past is the past. But at the same time, citizens' campaigns to change the name of the street, to remove monuments to colonial masters, and to break with racist traditions, they continue, and they continue with increased intensity. But as you can see in this photo, which was taken only a few months back, this is the monument to Jan Pieterszoon Koen that I mentioned previously, the great master of colonialism project in Dutch East India. And as the protesters had announced that they would take the monument down, the Dutch state had provided security and protection to this monument in order to preserve it. But this would be all from me. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for these fantastic presentations. I'm sure we learned many new interesting facts, especially for me because of course, I read Jelena's paper, but I was completely oblivious about the Indonesian struggle for independence. So it's quite a new achievement for me. So just let me remind you that you can write the questions in the chat box or just apply to ask them live in person to both of our speakers. So first in line, I think it's Raiko, our co-editor, which has two questions. So Raiko, go ahead.
Yes, Danilo, thank you very much. Thank you, Jelena. Thank you, Adi. It was a great pleasure to hear you. I have two questions. For Jelena, how do Dutch people view the Spanish occupation of the Netherlands, considering that it was also some form of colonialism? And for Adi, how important is the issue of Kosovo status for Indonesian struggle to return East Timor to its full sovereignty? And thank you very much once again.
Adi, if you don't mind, I can go first. It's up to you.
Yeah, please, please.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Raiko, if you're referring to the days of the war, the 80 Years War, if I understood it correctly.
Yes,
so,
yes.
Well, there's that is also not such like historically, it is not such a uniform period that with just like Adi had presented on the history of Indonesia, which was not always Indonesia, it is the same pretty much with the history of the Netherlands, which sort of came out as a republic from that process of that war. So it is also something that is quite distant in the memory of the Dutch people, and it was the process that led towards, in a way, identification of the Dutch people, as the Dutch nation. And of course, it was very gradual, first with only 7 of the provinces, the so-called 7 Netherlands, declaring their status of separation and independence from the Habsburg Empire. Yeah, it's a history that is in a way relevant as a process for the formation of the Dutch statehood, but it is not formative in that particular segment as something that had particularly influenced Dutch identity. What is relevant, again, according to Gloria Wecker, that had done extensive research on these matters of identity and belonging, and this particular separation that exists in the Dutch society and Dutch culture between the so-called allochthon, what is sort of belonging to the nation, and what comes from outside of the nation. It is this interesting perception of otherness, which is connected to these notions of Europeanness and whiteness. So even though majority of the actual population of the Netherlands comes from other countries or has roots in other countries, has roots in even other parts of the world and other countries of Europe, other regions of Europe, those that are considered to truly be belonging in this in the public discourse, there's just this sort of implied understanding of those that are truly belonging to the Dutch nation are the ones with European roots, while people that have their roots in other continents, which are identified as persons, basically racialized persons identified as belonging to other races, Eastern Europeans, and other such basically immigrant groups, regardless of the time frame when it was that they entered Netherlands and what type of work or services they had provided for the Dutch state, they're considered to be foreign, even up to the 3rd generation. So that would be, thanks, Heiko.
Jelena, are you finished?
Yes, Adi, please go ahead.
Okay. So if I may, I will answer the question from Raiko. Thank you very much for the very interesting question. But again, here, because it's a quite sensitive issue, I have to repeat my disclaimer from the beginning that my answer will be based on my personal opinion, more of a scholar of international relations and political science, and not as a diplomat of the ministry, because the official position might differ, even though as far as I understand it, the official position is also quite similar to the answer that I will give. But just for you to know that my words are not the exact position of the Republic of Indonesia. So in terms of Kosovo, the official position of Indonesia is that we still recognize it, of course, as the territory of the Republic of Serbia. And if you ask the government of Indonesia, of course, they will answer that this is because of our long history of friendship with Serbia, even from the beginning, from the era of Yugoslavia. We had really long history of friendship from the founding of the non-aligned movements, which was being founded by 5 countries at that time: Indonesia, Yugoslavia, Ghana, Egypt, and was it India? Yeah. And also, but on the other hand, we also have to be realistic and see that, as I already mentioned before, Indonesia is a very diverse country. So any question of subversion movement, any question of disintegration movement in other countries should be dealt with carefully by Indonesia. And based on this, Indonesia almost never recognized any separatist movement from another country, including with Kosovo. Now, Indonesia, of course, has a lot of pressure in order to recognize
Sorry,
Kosovo because it is.
Can I
Yes, please.
interfere just a bit?
Yes,
Because
please.
it was very interesting. Did Indonesia recognize immediately the independence of Slovenia and Croatia, or Indonesia done it a bit later? Because you mentioned that.
Yeah,
Sorry,
yeah, about our position. Yeah, yeah. So basically, after Slovenia and Croatia were also recognized by Yugoslavia at that time, then of course we had no problem for recognizing them. So this is the main point. Even Indonesia is under very intense pressure in order to recognize Kosovo, because practically almost all members of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation already recognized Kosovo, and even many times the delegations from Kosovo came to Indonesia in order to gain the recognition of Indonesia, because of course, as the biggest Muslim country in the world, the support from Indonesia would be very symbolic and very important for Kosovo, in which they have the majority of Albanian, which are Muslim populations there. But even so, we never base our recognition of independence only solely because of religion, because of ethnicity, or because of those superficial, I would say, reasons. And we of course always recognize the sovereignty of other countries, and that's the main principle enshrined in the United Nations Charter. And secondly, about East Timor, this is also quite interesting because the condition is not really the same with Kosovo, because again, as a scholar of international relations and political science, not as the representative of Indonesian government, actually I could say that Indonesia did not really have fully the rights in order to own, let's say, East Timor, because legally speaking, the territory of today's Indonesia is the ex-territory of the Dutch East Indies. So based on the principle of decolonization, we have to take into consideration the border of the Dutch colonies. And East Timor at that time was not under Dutch rule, it was under Portuguese rule. But because at that time, after the Portuguese step back from the island when they had the Carnation Revolution, there was a vacuum of power. And then after that, a civil war ensued. And the winner of the so-called civil war was Fathalin, which was kind of communist and allied with the international socialist movement. And because of that, the Western powers deemed it to be too dangerous to leave it at its own device, and they gave support to Indonesia, to Suharto at that time, to subjugate East Timor and to make it part of Indonesia. And it was already discussed many times, regularly even, in the United Nations Security Council regarding the subjugation of East Timor by Indonesia. But of course, nothing was done at that time because of American veto. And of course, as I told you before, the USA kind of supported the subjugation of East Timor. And even our Minister of Foreign Affairs at that time, His Excellency Mr. Ali Alatas, said that East Timor was a pebble in our shoes, which means that we can never run, we couldn't even walk properly if we didn't take it out from our shoes. So it was a problem. We realized that it was problematic in order to continuously hold East Timor, so that after it gained its independence, Indonesia was among the first countries who actually acknowledged the independence of East Timor. And we have very good relations now. Even the ex-prime minister, which used to be imprisoned by the government of Indonesia, Sanana Gusmao, actually becomes the ambassador of East Timor for Indonesia now. And also, we actually are the one who support East Timor candidacy in ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. We're always supporting them and bringing up the question of East Timor as the future candidate of ASEAN. So we have no problem with their independence. After it happened, we support their independence, and it's in that sense, it's a very different position than the one that we have to Kosovo and the ones that Serbia has to Kosovo.
Okay, thank you. We have two more questions. So Lauren has a question for Jelena regarding the understanding of the legacy of Dutch state and colonialism and the slave trade. Did you find that there is any historic relationship between the courts and ideas of justice of The Hague and the crimes of Dutch colonial past? Well, this is interesting.
Thank you, Danilo, for reading the question. Yeah, it's a very interesting and very comprehensive question that would deserve a presentation of its own, because these are all very highly relevant, but also interconnected points. And definitely, yeah, we can for now limit answer to this question to this one explanation, one interpretation that I had already partially mentioned, which is the explanation of certain workings, of certain paradoxes which are at play in the Dutch society that Gloria Wekker had mentioned, where this phenomenon of white ignorance, of not wanting to know, is actually crucial for the preservation of a certain kind of a self-image. But one of the other paradoxes that she mentions is also this self-image of victimhood. So Netherlands chooses also to remember more recent part of its history, which is the Second World War. So the part of the memory of self, in a way, is that memory of victimhood, of the struggle under the occupation, which in a way is also used as a certain form of like a historical narrative rupture to produce this image of the Dutch as solely victims, but never the perpetrators. So these things sort of come together and enable what I had mentioned at some point in the presentation, I believe, is a kind of moral high ground, which is not an accidental, it is a position, a sort of a epistemological group position of choice. And for that particular thing to sort of come to life, to exist and to continue to operate as a sort of a defense mechanism, the international courts that I think that Lauren is referring to, The Hague, which is there to pass judgment on others and their war crimes and atrocities, it's actually instrumental in erasing and in a way making completely redundant the Dutch past of unthinkable crimes, massacres, and genocides, as a matter of fact. Thank you, Lauren, for the question.
Okay, and our last question for today from Michael Bianc. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong. So the question for the both of you: are there any parallels between colonialism in East India, Dutch colonialism, and in the West Indies, British colonialism? Is there a particularly different tone to the racism experienced? How was the capitalism carried out any different? So you can choose.
Please, Jelena, you can start. Mm-hmm. Then I will add some.
It's up to you, Adi. Yeah. Well, I will give you the opportunity, Adi, to explain more about the workings of capitalism in Dutch East India, so to speak. But yeah, regarding, I will actually just refer very briefly to the West Indies, because there we have in this relatively small region, island region of the Western Hemisphere, we actually have a location where Dutch, British, French, and Nordic colonialisms meet, because in amongst these islands we have territories that were under control of Dutch, France, UK, but also the Kingdom of Denmark and Norway. And some of these territories have also changed hands. And as I had mentioned earlier in this presentation, like many of these locations, the structures of governance and the actual purpose and the methods of colonial exploitation varied, but they varied only due to convenience of the colonizer. So there are these commonalities which come out of the systems of exploitation, but at the same time, each of the colonizing powers had their own methodologies and their own approaches. But yeah, Adi, you can take it from here.
Yeah, so again, a very interesting question, and I would relate back to my previous statement in the presentation. The West Indies and the East Indies were like brothers from different parents, worlds apart. There are, of course, some similarities, but also some really striking differences. First of all, is that in Indonesia, in the very beginning, the Dutch East Indies, the association of the corporation of Dutch East Indies, they began with trading. So they didn't just come and claim the lands or enslave the people, which is a bit different than the pattern that is conducted in the West Indies. So in the beginning, it was purely trade, because they had only economic motives in the beginning. In the end, of course, we saw that maybe that we were not really enslaved technically, but if you saw the practice, it was, I mean, in all intents and purposes, you could still call that slavery, the cultuurstelsel that I was describing before, that Jelena also described before. So maybe it had a different beginning, but in the end, it was still the same exploitation of the people and of the natural resources of the land. And also, even though we didn't really have slaves coming to Indonesia, unlike, again, in West Indies, where many African slaves were brought there by the colonial power, there was also an interesting occurrence in which some of the Javanese people from Indonesia, at that time, again, Indonesia didn't exist, it was the Dutch East Indies, were brought to Suriname to become indentured laborers in the plantation, which again, for all intents and purposes, they were also kind of slaves. And because of that, now we have a sizable population of Javanese people in Suriname, or also known by the name Dutch Guyana, in which they can speak Javanese, but of course they don't know Indonesian, because Indonesian language didn't exist at the time before they came there. And Indonesia has a very good relations with the Javanese population there. So, sorry, it's a bit out of topic, but yeah, again, drawing from the commonalities, of course, the exploitation, but there are some differences in the patterns, especially in the initial stage of colonialism in West Indies and East Indies.
So
hope it answers.
I hope you can see the follow-up from Mikhail. So, any thoughts on reparations in principle, in a monetary sense? Would you like to comment?
You would like to have this question about reparation?
It's a great question. It's a great question, Mikhail. And yeah, thank you very much for that question, because this is actually a key word, reparations. And it is somehow always in these dealings between former colonial empires and their former colonies. It is somehow always the word that comes last to mind after all of these decades and years and different processes of decolonization. And I think we also did not spend enough time, because we are limited with time, but unfortunately we could not tell more stories about that period in Indonesia between 45 and 49, that period of time when the Dutch army, which was especially basically recruited, mobilized for the purposes of suppressing and again irrationally, delusionally trying to gain back control over Indonesia, of these atrocities that were committed and the incredible sacrifices of the people in current day Indonesia, because these are the things that are or events that are literally in a way beyond our ability to comprehend cruelty. And just as an example, so this was something that had happened after Second World War, and it happened in the period of time when supposedly the world had already been sensibilized. It's been made aware of certain extreme cruelties of war and crimes against humanity, but still these crimes were committed by the Dutch forces against the people of Indonesia in the same manner as Nazi crimes had been committed during the Second World War. So it's in a way illustrating how this situation with reparation works when we look at the case of, I think, Sulawesi and the families, the survivors of the victims of particularly cruel actions, police actions of retributions, when, for instance, only in some random individual cases and some small group cases, reparations for certain groups of peoples and families had only been granted now in the last decade by the Dutch courts and the Dutch state. And in some cases, as a matter of fact, even with the previous decision by the Dutch court, reparations had to be made, the state had hesitated with actually making the payments until these last couple of years. Adi, I'm sure that you can tell more about that. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you, Jelena. Actually, I would like to tackle the essence of the question, which is about the repatriation, the reparation in terms of money. There is a very interesting period of Dutch colonialism in Indonesia, in which they implemented the so-called Dutch ethical policy, which was started in the 1900s, right after the bankruptcy of the Dutch East Indies Company. So when Indonesia came under the direct rule of the Netherlands. So at that time, the government of the Netherlands, they started to realize the atrocities that they have been conducting for hundreds of years in the territory of modern Indonesia, and they would like to make amends to it, so that they started to conduct policies. They call it, there are three main points of the policies. First, irrigation, in which they created appropriate irrigations for the people of Indonesia so that they can plant their crops and to also have their own food crops, not only commodity crops sold to the Netherlands. The second one is the policy of migration, in which they try to reduce the density in the main island of Java, because Java is actually not a pretty big island in Indonesia. It's just the fifth biggest island, but it contains more than half of the population of Indonesia. And thirdly, the policy of education, in which they gave scholarships to many Indonesians to study in the Netherlands, and many of these students actually became the founding fathers and the founders of nationalist movements in Indonesia afterwards. But we have to know that these policies were extremely underfunded, and of course they could not erase the hundreds of years of exploitation that Indonesia already suffered under the Netherlands. And it is also very interesting that after the independence, or even during the struggle of independence, the idea of reparation never really crossed the minds of the Indonesian people, because they had only one focus, which was the independence. And after the independence, we didn't really want to have many things to do with the Dutch. I mean, it's also showed by our choice not to give any official status of the Dutch language. Even now, if you come to Indonesia, practically nobody will speak Dutch. They will know only one or two words, which were already adopted to Indonesian language. And we are just happy enough if the Dutch would return many of the collections of our ancient history. You know, it's something that is very familiar with with you as this with the countries in Africa, in South America, in which the European colonial power took many important historical artifacts from there. So yeah, in terms of historical artifacts, it would be nice for us to have them back, but in terms of monetary repatriation, I don't think that it's something that is really realistic for us to pursue. And also it is very problematic in how to make the calculation, because, you know, it's a different time. There were different people, many people already passed away. So, and also, if anything, it might be counterproductive to the good relations that now we already have with the Netherlands, because now also most Indonesian people, I mean, these good relations exist not only in the level of the politics, of the level of the country, but also exist in the level of the people. Like most Indonesians now, they harbor no hatred of the Dutch people. If you ask most Indonesians who are visiting the Netherlands, they are actually pretty happy with the attitude of the Dutch people there. Like, we have a very good cordial relationship between us, and you know, the discourse of reparation might bring more harm at this point of time than benefits, I think, for the case of Indonesia. For the West Indies, it might be a different story, of course, altogether.
Okay, so before I conclude our today's meeting, there is only two things left for me to do. The first one is a kind of personal note from me for those who are interested in the reparations question. You can take a look at the wonderful debate organized by Oxford Union a couple of years ago. Does Britain owe reparations? So it's a really fascinating debate. And the final thing, of course, is to announce our next lecture. It will be held on March the 29th. It will be about German colonialism. It will be held by our contributor, Mikhail Anatolovich, and we will probably go back to our regular time frame at noon Serbian time. Of course, pay attention to the website. We will keep you posted.